Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 for the CSC 227 class. If you haven't seen the syllabus video, kind of the orientation intro video, go check that out because there's a lot of good information in that video, and it also highlights not only like how this course is going to roll out and what the expectations are, but it also highlights the aggressive timeline that we've set for the labs and the discussion and the assignments and all that content. So I want to make sure that you have clarity on how this class is going to work and what you can expect and stuff like that. So this is the lectures, right? So I made videos for the labs. I made videos, or I've brought some information, videos for the discussions, and now I'll have this more formal lecture series as well. So we'll do probably 12 lectures. We'll go through them all, and it'll be a good time. So this first lecture is more of just a high-level introduction. We'll touch on a couple, key terminologies, very, very high level, kind of touch on all of the different things that we're going to be talking about through this semester. So think of this lecture as really just kind of a like a tasting menu of like what the course will actually be. So many of the topics that we talk about today, we will have dedicated lecture on specifically, okay? So let's get into it and let's have some fun. Okay, so, and today we're going to be talking about the top threats to computer networks, the likelihood of an attack, which is part of the risk calculation. We'll talk about some key terms like I had mentioned, which includes cracker, firewall, authentication. Sneaker is in here because it probably will be part of the quiz. The term sneaker isn't really used that often in industry anymore. That's kind of a throwback word, but it's one that's in the curriculum. We'll talk about perimeter versus layered approaches to network security. Defense in depth is a concept that we'll touch on. This will really be more just introducing the idea, not really getting into it too much, and then obviously we'll cover a bunch of resources that you can go to if you'd like additional information on any of these items. Okay, so I know that graphic is difficult to read, but what I wanted to point out is, why is cybersecurity important? Well, if you think about the way our society currently is and the way that we're going, we are hyper-connected. The internet is, probably one of the most critical resources that we have. Everybody's connected. You yourself probably have multiple devices on the internet, right? So you've got your phone, you've got tablets, you've got your TVs, your video game systems, your personal digital assistants like your Siris and your Google Homes. Like everything is hyper connected, and when things are connected, people can abuse them or take advantage of them or access them. So it really is a battleground that needs to be properly secured. And part of this class, the point is to equip you and make you aware of what options there are available to you for personal security, and also for, if you wanted to go on and have a career in cybersecurity. The graphic, I know it's difficult to view, but it's basically just highlighting the massive adoption of technology, network connected technology, in the last 20 years. So how is personal information safeguarded? What are vulnerabilities and what secures these systems? So if you think about it for a minute, our personal information is everywhere. We put our names and socials and all sorts of personal data into web apps all the time. When you pay your taxes, you might do it online. Online banking is obviously online, right? So we have all of our own personal information. You yourself may have received a letter or two or three from various organizations that have suffered a data breach where your personal information was compromised, right? So it's very important to understand how do we handle that information and how is it safeguarded. Now, vulnerabilities are another thing that we're going to be talking about. Very, very important in the cybersecurity realm. Vulnerabilities are basically weaknesses in systems, software, or people. Now, at a very high level, you got to think of it this way. When a system is built, right, or software is written, the developers do their best, right, to make good programs, but unintended consequences, misconfigurations, situations that they hadn't considered or thought through during testing could arise, which does happen all the time. And then, people who are technically savvy, and they don't have to necessarily be criminals, right? They could be security researchers, which is a whole field all into its own. Probe and touch and fuzz and prod these softwares and figure out ways to get elevated access, get data out of it, just compromise it in all these different ways. And those vulnerabilities then get disclosed to the vendor, to the software developer, or whoever, and they then patch them. And that's what patching is. I'm sure you've heard of patching. Patching is basically closing up vulnerabilities. Exploitation is taking advantage of the vulnerabilities to get into the system in a way that was not intended. So we'll spend some time talking about vulnerabilities this semester. We'll do a lab actually using a vulnerability scanner to scan a system. It's the last lab, Lab 8. So you can really appreciate and understand what we're talking about when we say vulnerabilities. Now, what secures these systems? In our world, defense in depth is a concept that says you don't just put like a lock on the front door and say the house is secured. You put a lock on the door, you put camera so you can see who's at the door. Maybe every time the door opens and closes, a record is written to a computer somewhere saying that the door had been opened or closed, or who actually accessed the system, right? So there's all these layers of controls, and that's the approach to securing systems. Now it gets a little tricky because those controls typically have a cost associated with it, right? How much money would you or the business spend to reach a level of risk that's acceptable to you, right? Here's a fact. You cannot completely secure any system. There will always be some level of risk that is accepted. But how much risk is there? Do you do nothing? Do you invest 10% of your capital? Do you invest 50% of your capital, etc.? So securing systems is a very complicated, very dynamic topic, and one that we'll get into through the semester. So how serious should we take security? So let me ask you, are you the type of person who thinks that, you're not a target, no one's coming for you, what's the big deal? Even if they did, what would you care? Are you on the other end of the spectrum where you are hyper sensitive to being a victim? Perhaps you've had identity theft conducted on you and you know what it feels like to be a victim, or someone's broken into your email or worse, your bank account. So are you in that? Or are you maybe more in the middle ground where you respect that there is risks out there, but the likelihood that's going to happen to you isn't really that high. So you don't share your password or stuff like that, but you also think like, it's okay. I'll just use the same password in multiple places because really, what's the big deal? So where are you? I'd be kind of curious. And this class is asynchronous, so I'm really looking towards the discussion in the kind of the forums for us to engage. So I'm interested where you are on that. Now, okay, so when you're actually calculating risk, like what is the level of risk? How likely is this event to happen, and what would be the financial burden, or what would be the impact of the event being realized? There's techniques to calculate that risk, and there's quantifiable ways with metrics and numbers, and then there's qualified ways where it's very subjective, and it's kind of like, based on what we think, it's kind of, high, medium, or low. At the top, you can see some formulas that are used more in the quantifiable realm of risk calculation. It isn't really used that often because it's very difficult to put a financial cost on something like email, for example, right? Like organizations use email all the time, but what is the expense of the email system going down? It's very, very difficult to quantify that in a financial number. So I haven't really seen these quantified risk formulas work, but they're always in the literature. So we definitely wanted to mention it. Much more common is what you see in the matrix below, where it is subjective and kind of qualified. So, when you're calculating risk, you look at the likelihood of an event happening and then what is the impact of it happening. So, how likely is it to occur and how bad will it be if it happens, right? So when we talked about vulnerabilities earlier, that is something that you actually need to understand what the risk is. So if you have going back to Exchange, if you have a vulnerability in Exchange, but it's like really, really, really unlikely to be exploited because, you gotta do like multiple things and it's very, very difficult, and you have to already have, domain admin access or whatever. So you could say, using the matrix below with likelihood on the left, that the likelihood of it happening is actually quite rare. Now, what is the impact of it? Well, the impact is that email would be slower, right? So you might be like, well, that's kind of a marginal impact. That's not that bad. So the overall risk of that vulnerability is low, according to that calculation. So then you might say, well, if it's a low risk, we'll just accept it. We won't do anything else to protect or further secure from that vulnerability being exploited, right? But if it's something much worse, like Exchange will disappear, you could say, well, if we don't have email, that's a critical problem, right? So it's completely rare, but it would be a moderate risk at that case. So we probably should do something about it, maybe patch the system or, move off of Exchange and move to a different mail server perhaps. So that's what risk calculation is, and it's a pretty big part of cybersecurity. Yeah, I put this slide in here because this is how I feel about the quantified formulas for risk. It's just thumbs down. Yep, so qualitative risk is more common. I basically just went through and explained this. So, I won't spend time on this, but this is basically how you calculate those qualified risk scores. Now, when you're dealing with risk, so going back a slide, so we said that, let's just pretend that we have a risk that's moderate, dead center, okay? When we need to do something about it, what are our options, okay? Well, these are the 4 options exhaustively of what you can do with risk. You can mitigate it, which means do something about it. You can patch it, you can move off that system, you can cut down the amount of access to it. You can do avoidance, right? Avoidance means just completely eliminating it. So you're not going to completely eliminate email, right, for this example that I'm using, but maybe you make the email server not accessible from the internet, so it only works on your company's network, right? And now you've avoided the risk scenario, right? Somewhat. Or you switch platforms, right? You move off of Exchange onto some other mail server, and now you've avoided that risk because it's absolutely not there. There's transference, which is almost always associated with insurance, right? So we've got this problem. We're not going to do anything about it. We're going to buy a cyber insurance policy, and if someone does exploit that vulnerability and it results in an impact to our organization, we can use the cyber insurance money to make ourselves whole from whatever business financial loss we suffered from the event, right? So that's what transference is. And then acceptance is what I said earlier with that low risk. Just, it's okay, we're going to accept it. And that's fine. That's an option to the business. Now, as far as types of threats go, again, remember this lecture, we're just kind of touching on various parts of cybersecurity. When we're talking about types of threats, right, here's a list of some. Malware. So if you haven't heard of malware, it's malicious software kind of combined. Malware is basically all the bad stuff. It's the exploits that will try to punch through vulnerabilities. It is Trojan horses, it's viruses, worms, these type of things, botnets, you could argue are malware. Security breaches. So we talked a little bit about this. This is when data gets compromised on systems. So an unauthorized intruder accesses network resources and grabs data, and now you've got a breach on your hands, right? Denial of service, which we'll do an entire lecture on, is when you attack a system in such a way that it becomes unavailable to anyone. A really easy way to say this one would be, say you go to Starbucks and you're using the wireless network and then someone does a denial of service attack on the wireless network at the Starbucks you're at, and nobody can get on the wireless network. You've basically denied service of whatever the service is, wireless in this case, from everybody. Typically, denial of service attacks are used as more of a bludgeoning kind of weapon where you either use it to knock your competitor offline, or you do it to like basically kind of hold someone ransom and say, I'll stop doing the denial of service attack if you give me money or you do some other thing for me. And you might think like, oh, is that a big deal? Think about Black Friday and how much money is spent on Black Friday. If you were able to bring Amazon down on Black Friday and you said to Amazon, well, listen, if you give me $1 million, I'll stop the attack. They're going to make way more than $1 million that day, and they're definitely going to lose way more than $1 million that day if they're not up online. So denial, that's an example of how you might weaponize denial of service. Now, web attacks, web applications have become quite prevalent, right? And you can attack web apps. And we'll do a little bit of that this semester. Next lecture, we're actually going to be talking about the network stack, which, we'll get into kind of the web, TCP, the transport control protocol, and web services, for example, and stuff like that. So, but just know that like web attacks is basically pretty common, and it's attacking websites. And if you think about it, websites are intended to be accessible from anywhere on the internet. So of course they're going to be attacked because there's an entire planet of people, and a subset of those people are security, either researchers or black hat hackers, meaning cyber criminals, and they can attack all of those things. So session hijacking is another key term to know. It is not as prevalent as some of these other ones, but it's basically, when you log into something and you get a token, so when you come back to the site, you don't have to log in again. It's possible to steal those tokens and then reuse them. Like I'm not authorized to access your email, but if I have your token, I can hijack your session and access your email. Also, DNS poisoning. In the next lecture, the networking lecture, we will talk about what DNS is. But DNS at a very high level is translating a domain name like www.google.com to an IP address, because IP addresses is how computers talk to each other. It's part of the network stack. So when you type in google.com and hit enter, DNS resolves or translates the name that google.com, into an IP address that is a web server that Google owns and is serving up google.com. Well, you can do DNS poisoning where instead of returning the legitimate Google server IP address, an attacker can send their IP address of a malicious server that they control, and then it looks like Google. It says google.com in your web browser. You think everything's fine, and in reality, you're giving your information and data to criminals. A final topic is insider threats. Insider threats are basically people who work at an organization, trusted people at the organization, and they abuse their access, right? So it's like if you ever left a job and took like PowerPoint templates with you, or you took some intellectual property, then that's insider threat. And it's something that you just, as part of being a cybersecurity practitioner or thinking through all the risks from a cybersecurity perspective, it's another one that you need to consider. Now, when we're talking about malware, some specific malwares I already mentioned, but to go in a couple more, there's viruses, Trojan horses, which pretend to be something, but they actually got something else going on. Spyware, which is kind of like creepware or stalkerware, where it's like looking at your screen, it turns on your webcam, it's can be used for espionage. It can also be used for creepy use cases. And then a logic bomb, which is pretty clever and well named, which is a piece of software that does something very specific, but it only does it once a certain set of conditions is met. A common condition for a logic bomb is when a date or time occurs. So, the classic example of this is the disgruntled employee sets up a piece of malware that's going to wipe everything on the network, and they set it up for 3 months from now, and they get terminated, and they're expecting to get terminated, and obviously all their access gets shut off. and then 3 months later, the logic bomb goes off and wipes everything, and they're long gone, right? Oh, you can see that the slides are actually going to go into a little bit of the detail. So viruses are a very common version of malware. They can spread through email as attachments. Also, USB drives. People will put malware on USB drives or viruses and wait for someone to stick it in. A really popular and famous example of this is the Stuxnet virus, Stuxnet. I'd encourage you to Google that and check it out. You know, a big story, right? And viruses can do all sorts of things. You know, it says here, use system resources, cause slowdown or stoppage. Yeah, that's possible. There's like Code Red virus, I love you virus. Like there's a whole bunch throughout history. We'll do an entire class on malware or lecture on malware, so I won't go into too much. But nowadays, people don't write viruses just to like test things out. They write viruses because they want to accomplish some specific goal, typically to pull down more nasty malware and start doing like crypto mining or ransomware attacks and these things. As I mentioned, a Trojan horse, it's named after the Trojan horse. And it's essentially, you know, an app that looks like it does one thing, but it's also doing something else. So maybe you download a free app from the App Store that is a calculator. Okay. And it does calculations, so it's a cool calculator, no problem. But it also is taking screenshots, or everything you type on your keyboard on your phone is transmitted back to a server that's controlled by the developer of the app. So when you're typing your text messages or your passwords, those are being sent to the developer. That's an example of a Trojan horse, and it's actually not that uncommon, which is why you've got to be careful when you're downloading software that comes from an untrusted source. In fact, a lot of things are interesting nowadays because if you've noticed, like Apple does it quite a bit, Android's doing it some, where it'll tell you specific apps and what resources they're trying to access. They want to access your microphone, your screen, your clipboard, your photos, your calendar, your contacts, right? These are all things that, you know, Trojan horses would have done and probably would have just gotten access to before right away, but now you have to explicitly opt the app into accessing those things. Now, spyware, we talked about a little bit. There was an excellent talk at DEF CON 25 from, you know, the most expert on Mac malware, Patrick Wardle. I suggest you could check that out if you're interested in Apple malware and Mac malware. He did one on Fruit Fly. But basically, it's what you think. It's spying on you. That's why it's called spyware. Keylogger is, again, a piece of software that'll, like, everything you click on your keyboard, it makes a record of it, logs it, and then sends it back to the bad guys. The Fruit Fly was the macOS Fruit Fly was actually an example of malware where it could take screenshots, it could write files, it could move the mouse around, like, so it could move the mouse to a certain spot and simulate a clicking. So, you know, like a attacker could effectively, you know, maneuver around on the machine. So that's what spyware is. Okay, and the logic bomb I already told you about and gave a good example, so we won't spend time on that. Now, compromising system security, right? So what's an intrusion? An intrusion is when someone basically is on your network and they're unauthorized. They're intruding on your resources, right? It's the same idea as someone busting into your house, right? It's an intrusion. Now, there's different kind of attacks and groups of attackers, right? So hackers is definitely a term that is well versed in our society. And it basically means security researchers, either good or bad. The term is so synonymous with cybersecurity that, you know, newspapers and news reporting outlets will often use the term hacker, even if it wasn't a hack. But there's crackers, which was, that term has kind of gotten absorbed into hackers. But back in the day, a cracker was someone who would like break either, it's called like cracking the software. So maybe there's like a password to like use something, or you need a license key. A cracker would be someone who would like go in and work out a way to crack through those controls, effectively getting the software for free. You don't see it too much anymore because the business model for software has changed. So cracking isn't really a thing, but Social engineering is attacking humans. So earlier I said vulnerabilities of systems and humans. Some people don't really think about this, but social engineering is where you're taking advantage and you're preying on the fact that the person that you're targeting, your victim, wants to be helpful or doesn't understand technology to the point where you can trick them, right? So right now we've got a bit of an epidemic with tech support scam calls where a pop-up will come up on your screen. It'll say that your computer's infected and you need to call this number. Now, if you're a tech-savvy person, you might say, well, this is ridiculous. No. But if you're not, and this preys on elderly people all the time, they'll call the number and then this scammer will be like, oh, yeah, like your computer's messed up. I need you to give me a credit card so I can charge $500 so I can help you. So first of all, they just rip $500 off. Then they socially engineer you to install software. They get on your computer and then they do really bad stuff. So that's what social engineering is. And then war driving is kind of the idea of driving around with a wireless antenna and looking for networks and seeing which ones are open or what level of security they have, and then possibly breaking into or breaking onto those networks and beginning to look at the traffic, because wireless networks and wireless network traffic is everywhere, so you can just grab it out of the air if you know how. That's what's going on there. All right. So denial of service, I've already explained. With a denial of service attack, you do not need to intrude into the network, right? Web apps are like a classic example. You can just flood a web server with requests and basically overwhelm it. And that's the deal. So like I said, we'll do a whole class on denial of service, so I won't get into too deep. Now, web attacks, this is what I was saying about attacking web application platforms. So if you've logged into the Citadel website, which you had to have to get to Canvas so you could get to this class, you know, most of us put in our username and password like you can see here on the left, right? Here's my name, here's my password, let me sign in. Well, there is a database on the back end that, you know, is basically holding the username and passwords, right? And you got to verify, is this entry in the database? I'm oversimplifying it for the sake of this discussion, but like, you get what I'm saying. So by putting in a specially crafted username that is not a username, but it's actually a query written in the language of databases, you can actually or potentially query the database for information that it wasn't designed to be interacted with. Right, so web developers need to be cognizant of this and make sure that they're doing input validation on the input fields before sending it to the database. This is called a SQL injection attack, and it's actually quite common even today. I've already talked about session hijacking and DNS poisoning. There's a YouTube video if you want some more information on how to do that or what it is in a greater detail. So, you know, assessing the likelihood of an attack. So let's talk about some quick high-level basic security terminology. As far as people operating in the cybersecurity space, there's three kind of categories that people have: white hat, black hat, gray hat. There's been some discussion in the industry about changing these terms, but right now these are still kind of the terms that are being used. A white hat is a, and this comes from like the Wild West kind of idea of like the good guy, the sheriff would wear a white hat and the bad guy would always wear a black hat, and that's how you could kind of tell who was who. White hat hackers are security researchers. They hack for good. They try to help people. You can have an entire career, very successful, very lucrative career, I might add, doing white hat hacking and penetration testing. Black hats are doing the same thing the white hats are doing, except they are doing it in a criminal way. They don't have access or they don't have permission or authorization to do the hacking that they're doing. Oftentimes they'll steal from victims, or they'll hold victims, you know, their data ransom. And then there's gray hats, which is kind of a blend between white hat and black hat. And this is the idea that like you do things for good, but maybe maybe you don't follow the rules, or you don't ask for permission, you just do things, or you could be both a black hat to fund yourself and do bug bounties on the side, which is kind of a white hat controlled program for doing penetration testing. Some other terms of individuals operating in our space is script kiddies. And a script kiddie is basically someone that doesn't really understand what they're doing, but because security tools are widely available and anyone can download them, they just download it, point it at a target, and click now, right? They don't understand why it works, how it works, anything about it. They just know that if they point it and hit go, it will compromise the machine. That's what a script kiddie is. It's basically people who don't understand what's going on. Again, there's the term of sneakers. That's an older term, and sneakers is basically just an antiquated way of saying hacker, so no one really uses it anymore. And then there's ethical hackers, which are essentially the white hat hackers that I talked about before, but the term ethical hacker is becoming more of the normal nomenclature than calling someone a white hat. So some security technologies that we'll be touching on. Firewall, it basically is a gateway that allows network traffic into or out of a network. We'll actually be doing a lab where we configure a firewall, so you can kind of see like what network traffic looks like when there's no firewall, and then when you configure it to block the traffic, how that works. So that'll be a fun lab to look forward to. There's proxy servers, which basically stand in front of systems. So the IP address range behind it is masked or natted, so you can get more IP space. Again, we'll talk about this in the networking class, but that's another kind of technique. And then there's intrusion detection systems, which is a tool that helps security professionals do their job. And basically these IDSs are looking at traffic, looking at logs, trying to identify anomalous behavior or weird accessing from like a country that doesn't normally like access your network, like all of a sudden, or it's a weird where I log in from Charleston, South Carolina, and then 20 minutes later I log in from Ukraine. Like that's definitely not possible. So there's like the intrusion detection system would notify the security team at that point to look into it and do some analysis. As far as some, again, more terminology, authentication is when you're putting in your username and password. Maybe you do multi-factor authentication. You may be familiar with that term, but it's basically validating to a system that you are, in fact, the person who's been granted the authorization to access the system, and that's the technical mechanism that does it. Most people think of username and password when they think of authentication. Another key element is auditing. We will be doing a little bit of auditing work in our labs later in the semester, but essentially auditing is one of the most important things from a security perspective, because when bad stuff happens, all you have is the audit logs to piece together what happened and understand the true scope of the problem or the intrusion or the virus outbreak, right? So auditing is critical and quite important in our industry. So some more kind of concepts on how we protect our network. The CIA triangle, this is like, this is a kind of entry-level course to the industry. The CIA triangle is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. And that's the three core security principles when we're doing any work in cybersecurity that we think of, right? So when you're like, confidentiality is only the people who need it get access to it. Integrity is that the data isn't modified in any way that's unacceptable. And availability is when the people need it, it's available, right? So any control that we ever put in place has to address one or more of these, right? So when we talk about firewalls, right? Firewalls are intended to prevent people from accessing our network that aren't authorized. This is the confidentiality objective, right? It's there. Same with username and password, right? Again, it's protecting the confidentiality of your email because only you can access it. But the email system has a backup system. They take backups every day because if there's an issue, the availability would come into question. But because they have backups, they can restore and make that data available again. Least privilege is the concept of only giving access that you need for something. So just because you're an authorized user of your company's network doesn't mean you're authorized to access HR personnel files, right? So least privilege is basically the concept and technique of giving you access you need to do your job or to do whatever it is that is appropriate, and only that. It's very difficult to actually do in practice. Perimeter security approach and layered security approach. I've already talked about defense in depth, which is what that layered security approach is. And with perimeter, this used to be the way before cloud really took off, but a perimeter is like a big, strong, think of a castle with a moat and a bridge and stuff like that. We have firewalls on the outside. We have guns, guards, and gates, swipe access, thumbprint readers to get into places. So the perimeter, that's the idea, that you have a strong perimeter. But now with cloud and with just the internet being so present, a lot of resources are accessible from anywhere in the world. So the perimeter model doesn't work as well. And now you might hear the term zero trust architecture or user-centric architecture. And that's really where it is now. And it's all about controlling the access and making sure that the individual user access is tightly controlled, which is why multi-factor authentication is so important today's age. Proactive versus reactive, right? So when I told you before, like in the world of cybersecurity, you protect, and then which is like, all right, I'm going to try to prevent everything bad from happening, but I'm realistic to know that bad stuff will happen. So putting in the right stuff in place and then being able to react to it when it happens is kind of the two elements. So I wouldn't really say proactive versus reactive. I'd say it's proactive and reactive. The only problem with being exclusively reactive is you're constantly operating from a position of weakness, because you're not really trying to protect your assets or your data or whatever you're protecting. You're just waiting for bad stuff to happen and then quickly put the fire out, right? So a hybrid security method, again, as I talked about cloud and all these other things, it's really about, with cloud, the vendor like Amazon or Microsoft Azure, like they are securing parts of that environment for you, and you're securing other parts. So if it's like, for example, think about your email. If you use Google Mail or Yahoo Mail or Hotmail or any of those, it's cloud-based, right? The operating system, the physical hardware, the actual facility it's in, all of that is secured by Google or Microsoft or whatever. Access into your account is secured by you. So they can have the best security ever. If you have a crappy password and you use it everywhere and it gets involved in a breach, and a threat actor logs into your email account, you've just had an intrusion and a compromise, and it has nothing to do with how awesome the tech stack is that Microsoft or Amazon was using, right? So that's the hybrid security model where multiple parties are involved in protecting the assets. So I do want to point out, we will be covering a lot of techniques in this class on how to do offensive security operations, like take over machines, bust through things, exploit vulnerabilities, etc. Like there's a lot of really cool stuff that we'll learn, but it can be used for bad. So I want to point out, A, don't do that, right? This is educational purposes only. B, the Computer Security Act of 1987 is the law that is currently used. Basically, if you've ever heard of a hacker being sent to jail, that is the law that is very, very broad and very, very ambiguous. It's the law that's used for I guess, justice of hackers, right? I put a couple other elements in here, right? So FISMA is a federal information security standard. So if you're going to work in federal, you got to be FISMA compliant. We've got HIPAA down there for healthcare. So these are just some of the legal frameworks and regulatory bodies around cybersecurity. If you're interested in learning a little bit more before the next lecture, or you just want, I've put some resources here. CERT is a kind of an international emergency response resource. Check that out. Microsoft Security Advisor, right? So that's a good resource of timely information. And I've got some other ones here, F-Secure and SANS, that provide, education, current threat feeds and stuff like that. So it just, if you're interested, this is more of a, if you want to take it a little bit further on your own. All right, so in summary, network security is a changing field. It's not just networks, right? It's users, it's applications, it's endpoint systems like workstations and laptops, tablets, phones, cloud. It's way more than network, okay? So it's constantly changing, and that's what, personally, why I love the field so much. But that's why we're going to talk about a lot of things in this class. You'll notice in the discussions that they're set up, there's a lot of like current, timely things in there, because I really want to bring you into modern, like we're going to be talking about academic type cybersecurity stuff, right? The fundamentals. But it's important to me to bring relevant current day use cases to your awareness, so you can see how it all ties together, right? So let's see. In order to stay kind of abreast of the field, you got to, obviously take courses like this, which is cool. You do need to understand whatever the system is that you're trying to secure if you're going to go on to work in the field. If you work in a Windows shop or a Cisco shop or whatever, if you're really good at a different technology, that's fine, but you really need to understand whatever the technology is that you're involved in securing, right? And just staying abreast of current threat feeds, current exploits and stuff like that. I personally, again, if you're interested in taking it a little bit further, CISO Security Headlines is a podcast that's about 6 minutes long. Every weekday, I listen to that. It's free. I listen to that every morning with coffee to give myself basically a threat briefing, because I work in the field, right? So, all right. I think that's going to do it for the first lecture. Again, it really was just a touch high level on a bunch of different topics. I'm really excited about this semester. Please keep an eye on deadlines. It's a compressed schedule. It's going to move very quickly. And we got labs, we got discussion, we got quizzes. Quizzes are open book, open internet. And yeah, let's have some fun, okay? All right, thanks so much.